So section 4.4, bonds and loanable funds. And what we're going to find in this video is that the market for loanable funds and the market for bonds are obviously interrelated. So we've got the market for loanable funds on the left, demand, supply, and the market for bonds on the right. Now, what I've got here is one economic event that shifts the demand curve to the right for loanable funds. But what I want to stress in this video is that the same event that shifts the demand curve for loanable funds to the right also shifts the supply curve for bonds to the right. So they're not two separate events, they're the same economic event. We're just analysing the same economic event in two separate markets. So to understand that, let's go to the market for loanable funds, and the demand curve shifts to the right. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, why do people demand loanable funds? Well, let's assume that it is a company, and the company is demanding loanable funds to finance investment. So investment spending is increasing by one or a number of companies, and that's shifting the demand curve for loanable funds out to the right. So in this market on the left, the equilibrium moves from A to B. Now remember, demanding loanable funds means you are borrowing money, and the money is going to be borrowed to finance this investment expenditure that I'm assuming is taking place. Okay, so on the left, we've got companies demanding more loanable funds, that is, they want to borrow more money, and we model that through a rightward shift in the demand curve for loanable funds. But then you've got to ask yourself the question, well, how do those companies actually borrow that money? They borrow the money by issuing bonds. And so they will sell a bond into the bond market, and in return for selling that bond, they will receive money in return. And it's that money that they are lending that they will use to finance their investment expenditure. So as companies on the left here increase their demand for loanable funds, they actually obtain that money by increasing the supply of bonds. So they'll be printing and issuing new bonds to demand those loanable funds or to borrow those loanable funds. So on the right, as we supply more bonds into the market, people are borrowing more money. The only reason you issue or supply a bond is to borrow money. So an increase in the supply of bonds means more money is being borrowed. That is the same thing as demanding more loanable funds. The thing to emphasize here is that we're not talking about different economic events. They're the same event, which we are modeling firstly through the loanable funds market and secondly through the bond market. So an increase in the demand for loanable funds is the same thing as supplying more bonds into the market. And so we can also see that we get this inverse relationship between bond prices and bond yields. So on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, we know that when there is more demand for loanable funds, when there's more demand for money, that is going to increase the bond yields or the interest rate. And I'm assuming that that goes from 4 to 5%. But in demanding more money, which pushes the interest rate up, more bonds need to be supplied, which will push bond prices down. So we get this inverse relationship between bond prices and bond yields. Bond prices go down on the right because more bonds are being supplied into the market because people want to borrow more money. And as bond prices fall, because the coupon payment is fixed, yields go up. Okay, I guess the only other thing to ask is, well, which occurs first? Is it prices that fall or is it yields that rise? It's actually prices that would fall. And then yields would rise as a result. So if you think about it, and this is not an overly important point, but just a minor point to make, these companies that want to borrow money, they want to borrow loanable funds to finance their investment spending, they would do that by going into the market and issuing new bonds. As they issue new bonds, the first thing to happen would be bond prices would fall. And as bond prices begin to fall, we tend to get interest rates then responding to that price fall. Well, not responding, but as prices fall, bond yields automatically increase because the coupon payment is higher. Okay, so more demand for loanable funds, more bonds are supplied into the market, bond prices fall, and as bond prices start to fall, yields start to rise. So the important thing about this is understanding that if you are given an economic event, such as a recession, a big increase in investment spending, the implementation of quantitative easing or quantitative tightening, which is the subject of your report, you can model those economic events from either this perspective, the loanable funds market, or the bond market, or both. Because these two diagrams will give you exactly the same answer in response to some economic event. So for example, if you had said to me, what is the impact in what is the impact in financial markets of a big increase in investment spending, then I could have simply drawn an increase in the demand for loanable funds and showed you the interest rate rising. Or I could have thought to myself, well, more investment spending, companies will be issuing more bonds to pay for that investment spending. So I could have come over here to the bond market, shifted the supply curve to the right, found that bond prices will then fall, and then use the inverse relationship between bond yields and prices to conclude that as bond prices fall, bond yields will rise. So either way, using either of these diagrams, I could quite easily show that an increase in investment spending will lead to higher interest rates in the domestic economy. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You can use either the market for loanable funds or the market for bonds because they're effectively the same thing, or both of these diagrams to analyze the effect of certain economic shocks or certain economic policy changes that influence bond markets and loanable fund markets.